last week we started a new series called Point of Victory. And I mentioned the idea of sometimes maybe in a battle or in a game, like maybe chess, there's a point where it's all over, but there's still steps to take to finish things up. So if you've ever been playing chess, and you can sort of see the moves ahead of time, or this usually happens in movies, and it's probably mostly fictional. I guess, high-end chess players can do this. See a number of moves ahead where they say, checkmate in 3. So they've already hit the point of victory. They know that they've got it wrapped up. They know it's guaranteed, but they still have to go through the process of taking the steps to finish it. I imagine the same thing is true in a battle, where a commander can look and sort of say, as soon as we've got that flank, we've got them. The battle's basically over, maybe even the war is over, but you still have to take the steps to finish things off. Are there any fans here of MMA, mixed martial arts, UFC? At least one or two guys, okay. I really enjoy MMA. I know it's kind of barbaric. It's not nearly as barbaric as it used to be. Like when it first started, my youth group would like when I was a kid in youth group, we would rent the pay-per-view for it, and they would have some tiny little guy up against like a sumo wrestler and just sort of it's like cockfighting. Just go, let's see what happens. There were no real rules. You get eye gouge, all punch below the belt, all kinds of horrible stuff. They've cleaned it up, and so it's a real sport now. But the thing I like about it is that going into it, anyone can win. And I don't mean anyone. I couldn't go in there and win. But if you got two guys with enough training, and they're matched up each other in the same weight class, it's flip a coin, because it's all you need is like one shot. All you need is like one kick to land the right way, or the other guy to make one little mistake, and you've got him. That's the point of victory. That one moment. There's this first scene. The guy jumps off the fence and kicks the other guy, and as soon as he does that, it's basically over. I mean, he has to land a few more shots before the ref stops it, but the match is over. Now, I grew up loving WWE wrestling. A few other people are nodding their heads. Good. The point of victory in a wrestling match happens before the match even starts. All right, I know, even when as a kid, I knew it was scripted, and I still love watching it just to see the amazing things that they could do. There was this thing called a squash match. A squash match is when you would have a superstar, someone like Hulk Hogan or the Ultimate Warrior, and they'd be up against Barry Horowitz, and you just know who's going to win. And this is just an opportunity for the Ultimate Warrior to show off his stuff. And he comes out, he's all tanned and muscly. The other guy's like pale white and skinny. And it's just like you already know that the match is over. The one guy might get a couple shots in, but it's a squash match. It's already determined who's going to win. I think God is more like a WWE match than an MMA match. The situation with God, because God's victory has never been in question. From the beginning of time, as soon as sin entered the world, it was not like, I don't know how this is going to turn out. God's victory has never, ever been in question. So your point of victory, my point of victory, comes down to the point trying to figure out when our point of victory is. It's when we decide to join God in His victory. That's really what it all comes down to. Now, for today's message, I'm going to start by saying that there are parts of the Bible that can be confusing. There are parts of the Bible that, some of them are totally clear, very, very simple, very easy. You come to it and it makes sense. There's other parts of it that are just really confusing. Like they kind of raise more questions than they answer. And you have to ask yourself, how do you respond to that kind of text? If you come to a text that's clear, it's easy. But if you come to a text that is confusing, what are we supposed to do with it as Christians? And the big idea today is that when you deal with Scripture that's confusing, hold dear to what Jesus makes clear. Hold dear to what Jesus makes clear. There's other parts of it, hold loosely. You might have an opinion, and that's fine. It's not a bad thing to study. I find some of it really interesting. I hope you do too. But I hold it loosely. There's parts of it I'm going to hold very tightly because Jesus has made it clear. So the passage we're looking at today is Mark chapter 13. And it starts at the temple. So up till now, Jesus, last week we talked about the triumphal entry. Jesus came into Jerusalem like in basically a parade, got there, looked around the temple, left, and then decided to come back the next day and start flipping tables. And then he left, and then he came back the next day, and he got challenged by the religious leaders, like, who do you think you are to come in here and vandalize the place, basically? And then that whole rest of that chapter is like Jesus responding to people who are challenging his authority. They're asking him questions. They're trying to do this like gotcha thing. I'm going to come up with a question that is so difficult that no matter what happens, it's going to split the room. Half the people will hate you, half may like you, but at least we're better off than we were before. And once we start to get that half hating you, it's not too long before we can get a mob to take you out, because that was their goal, was to kill Jesus. And so now we come to chapter 13. As Jesus was leaving the temple that day, one of his disciples said, "Teacher, look at these magnificent buildings. Look at all the impressive stones in the walls." And there's a part of me that says, Jesus had recently talked about being the cornerstone, the one that all the builders rejected, but becomes the most important stone. And looking back on it, 2,000 years of history and other people who are smarter than me, you could sort of say to the disciple, you're looking at these stones, you should really be looking at the cornerstone. Like, he's the most important one. But at the same time, if I was there, I would probably be amazed by the temple as well. It was an impressive building. And Jesus even says, yes, look at these great buildings. Actually, let's go back one slide. I just want to, Jesus agrees with them. It is impressive, and the temple was impressive. Josephus was a historian, and he says that the temple was covered, the top part of it was covered in gold plating, so that when the sun was shining on it, it would actually reflect, and it would be almost like too much to look at. The stones were all bright white and huge, gigantic stones. And it's so amazing what people in that day could make. I mean, you look at the pyramids, you look at some of these temples, and it's really, really impressive. This past week, I decided to basically fix up my patio stones in the front walkway. These things are about 100 pounds each. The 2 feet by 2.5 feet, and it's a pain. Like, you gotta put down all the limestone screening. First of all, I lift them all up. Actually, first of all, I bought a bunch from Home Depot and then brought them. And Kathy helped me, carry them. Then you lay them all out, and then you lift the old one up, and you put down some screening, some stone, and you put it in place, and you realize how much off kilter it actually is, or at least that's what I should have done. And I laid down about 3 or 4 of these, and then Kathy came and opened my eyes to the fact that they weren't exactly level where they should be. And I'll be honest, I was not particularly gracious at that moment. We worked it out. I apologize for my response, and it looks a lot better now than it did. But it was heavy work. It was hard work. Some of you may think I'm a wimp, but I don't care. They're heavy, okay? So you lay it down, and then you have to lift it up and then put more stone in, and then lay it back down. You put the level, and you hope it looks more or less okay. 100-pound stone. Some of these stones were tons. I have no idea how they would do it. I have no idea how they would get it all in place and make everything perfect and look. I mean, it's amazing. It would be difficult to make something as beautiful as the temple today. Much less, with today's engineering and machinery and all that kind of stuff, it was an impressive building. And Jesus says, yes, look at these great buildings, but they will be completely demolished. Not one stone will be left on top of another. So they're leaving the temple. The disciples are like, check out this amazing building. And Jesus says, it is amazing, but I got to tell you, bad things are going to happen. As amazing as this temple is, not one stone will be left on top of another. And that prophecy came true. Not too many years after that, about 40, 50 years after that, Jerusalem was in rebellion, and Rome basically came in and said, "We're going to clear up this rebellion." The biggest, strongest building they had was the temple. So, all the rebels fled to the temple, and what happened was someone threw in a torch somehow caught fire. All the gold that was on it started melting and coming down and falling in between all the stones. And the Romans said, you know what, let's get that gold. And they started tearing apart the stones. As heavy and big as they might have been, they tore them up and pulled out the stones so that not one stone was left on top of another. Let's go back to the story. Before that all happens, 40, 50 years before, Jesus makes this declaration, and then they leave. And you got to imagine yourself in the sandals of the disciples. They believe that Jesus is the Messiah. All right, they know the Old Testament scripture. They're looking forward to this time when the Messiah will come and he will reign in Jerusalem, and all the people will come and flock from all around the world to learn at the feet of the Messiah. And so the disciples are kind of like, how's this going to work? Like, you're the Messiah, you're going to reign in Jerusalem, and yet you're saying the temple will be destroyed. This doesn't make sense to us as we understand what the Messiah is supposed to be. And so later, Jesus sat on the Mount of Olives across the valley from the temple, which would have had a great view of the temple. Peter, James, John, and Andrew came to him privately and asked him, "Tell us, when will all this happen? What sign will show us that these things are about to be fulfilled?" So they basically asked two questions. When's it going to happen, and what sign should we look for? Now, previously in Mark, Jesus, didn't react too well to being asked for a sign, but this is a different kind of thing. Those people were asking for a sign because they didn't believe Jesus. These guys are asking for a sign because they do believe Jesus. They just want to know how we, what are the steps? As it's coming up, what are the things we should look for as it approaches this time? And so Jesus kind of starts with the second question. Verse 5, Jesus replied, "Don't let anyone mislead you. For many will come in my name, claiming I am the Messiah, and they will deceive many." And you could go back to the days of, first century AD, and go all the way through to today and talk about all the people who have claimed to be the Messiah. I just went back, just a short time in our history and looked at some of these people. Alan John Miller apparently is the Australian Jesus. He's a guy who is declaring that he is Jesus. And in fact, he says, "I'm Jesus, deal with it," which sounds very Christ-like. That's kind of what you expect from Jesus. If I mentioned Waco, Texas, some of you might think of decorating shows. A lot of us would think of David Koresh and the Branch Davidians, someone who claimed to be Jesus or some kind of second coming or something like that. A guy named Yahweh Ben Yahweh, someone named, it's hard to pronounce his name, Baha'u'llah, who started the Baha'i faith. Haile Selassie, who I don't think he ever actually declared to be Jesus, but all his followers said that he was. Shoko Asahara, he was a terrorist in the Japanese subway attacks, and he declared to be Jesus. Sun Myung Moon has declared to be Jesus. Most surprisingly to me, as I was going through this, it's a little bit hard to make out there, Ezra Miller, the guy who plays the Flash in the DC universe, has apparently declared to be that he is Jesus. Don't let anyone mislead you. I don't think anyone's buying the last guy. But a lot of people have followed some of these people and followed them to their death. And these aren't the first, and they won't be the last. Others will come declaring that they are the Messiah, that they are Jesus. They will deceive many. And so the disciples say, what are the signs? When's this going to happen, and what are the signs? And Jesus starts talking about signs. He says, people are going to come in my name declaring to be me, and they're going to deceive people. Verse 7, you will hear of wars and threats of wars, but don't panic. In other words, he's saying, I'm giving you some signs, but these aren't really the signs. Because right from the beginning, you've got people who are declaring to be the Messiah. I mean, pretty much since the beginning of time, we've had war. I've got just a few up here, right? Talking about the Punic Wars, the Crusades, the 100 Years' War, which actually wasn't 100 years, it's a bit of a misnomer, but Napoleon, the War of 1812 and all the time around surrounding that, World War I, World War II, right now we've got Ukraine and Russia. There have been very, very few days of peace when the world was not at war. And so are these signs we need to watch out for? Well, Jesus says, you're going to hear about these things, but don't panic. Yes, these things must take place, but the end won't follow immediately. So he sort of says, you want to know about signs? I'll tell you about signs, but these aren't the signs you really need to worry about. I'll get to that in a minute. But things are going to happen, and they're going to seem like, oh, this must be the end of time. Anyone feel like that? Anyone feel like, hey, we're in the final days here? I don't know if we are. Because people have felt like that for generations, for centuries. Everyone always seems to think that they're in the final days. And I don't mean this harshly, but to me it feels almost a little arrogant for us to suggest that we're in the final days today because I'm alive. Right? Or the idea that people do the math and they say, well, it's going to be exactly 2,000 years from the day Jesus died. Like God cares about the metric system? God's got his timing figured out, and we'll talk about that in a little bit here, but everybody always feels like these are the final days because things are so awful all the time. There's always war. But Jesus says, you know what? Don't panic. Yes, these things must take place, but the end won't follow immediately. There's going to be wars, but that's not the sign that you need to look for. Nation will go to war against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in many parts of the world, as well as famines. I mean, does that sound like the news all the time? But this is only the first of the birth pains, with more to come. So when Asher was being born, actually, I'm trying to remember if it was Asher or Abby. When one of them was being born, Kathy kept having these contractions, and we went to the hospital, and they'd say, it's not time yet. And they'd send us home. And then we went back to the hospital because they were increasing, and they'd be like, it's not time yet. And we came back, and basically as soon as we got back, we just did like a U-turn and went back right away because they were increasing. But Jesus is saying that these signs, they're kind of like the Braxton Hicks of the end times. Like you're going to get some of these signs, but the end isn't going to follow immediately. But he tells them this because there's an important reason. When these things begin to happen, watch out, because you will be handed over to the local councils and beaten in the synagogues. We see that in the book of Acts, right? We see that happening. You will stand trial before governors and kings before you're my followers. But this will be your opportunity to tell them about me. Like, you read through the book of Acts and you think to yourself, Paul really blew it. Because he could have very easily gotten away. Like he could have just said, you know what, I'm a Roman citizen. I don't want to be arrested, and they probably would let him go. But he kept appealing to someone higher. He says, I'm appealing to the governor. I'm appealing to the emperor. I want to go higher with this, because Paul knew. I mean, he wrote it in Philippians. To live as Christ, to die as gain. His goal was to send the message out, and what he really wanted was to take it as high as he possibly could. Why? Because when you're beaten in the synagogues, when you're standing before the local councils, when you're on trial before the governors and kings, this is your opportunity to tell them about me. And so Paul took that to heart. For the good news must first be preached to all nations. I don't know if you know, we're part of the Christian Missionary Alliance. It's a denomination. Actually, we've just officially been rebranded as the Alliance, because when we say Christian Missionary Alliance, we always say Christian Missionary Alliance, and people only catch the Alliance part anyway. But it was started by a man named A.B. Simpson. And he started it in two movements. It was like the Christian part of things, and we're going to look after the poor, the orphan, the widows. And the other part was like the missionary part of it. And part of the reason he did that is because of a verse kind of like this one. He says, the good news must first be preached to all nations. And so he said, I want Jesus to come back, so let's do everything we can to go and preach the good news to all nations. Because if that's got to happen first, then let's make that happen. And then it became, one movement under the Christian and Missionary Alliance, but that's who we are. But right into the DNA of who we are is this idea that we want to spread the good news to all nations. And at some point, it might mean that we stand trial before governors and kings. But if that happens, it's an opportunity to tell people about God. When you're arrested and stand trial, if this ever happens to any of you, And again, I don't foresee it necessarily anytime soon in Canada, but if you were in other parts of the world, it could certainly be a possibility. He says, don't worry in advance about what to say. Just say what God tells you at that time. For it's not you who will be speaking, but the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit is going to empower you to share the message about Jesus, because that's the most important thing. He goes on, he says, a brother will betray his brother to death, a father will betray his own child, children will rebel against their parents and cause them to be killed. Everyone will hate you because you're my followers, but the one who endures to the end will be saved. And again, we get glimpses of this in Canada, in North America. We get picked on social media when we stand up for Jesus. Other parts of the world, if you stand for Jesus, literally your family might kill you. They might betray you over to a different authority if you became a follower of Jesus, because you are abandoning your old faith and following Jesus. But the one who endures to the end will be saved. And then we get to, again, some of these things are kind of like, well, I understand what he's talking about, but I'm not entirely clear about the timeline. But then we get to this verse, chapter 14. The day is coming when you will see the sacrilegious object that causes desecration. Another translation talks about the abomination of desolation. And you're like, what is that? Well, if you go through Old Testament prophecy in the book of Daniel, he talks about this. I'm not going to read it right now. In brackets in my translation, it says, reader, pay attention. Right? There's this time coming when the sacrilegious object that causes desecration will be standing where he or it should not be. And so a lot of people thought that this was Antiochus Epiphanes. He was a Roman leader, and he brought the statue of Zeus into the temple. And then he desecrated the temple by sacrificing a pig on the altar. Now again, you know your Old Testament history, pigs were like literally not kosher, right? Don't touch pigs. Don't go anywhere near them. To actually sacrifice one on the altar of God is an incredible abomination. And yet that happened before Jesus. And so that can't be the abomination that causes desolation, because Jesus is actually talking about a future tense here. And so what is that? It's got to be something sort of along those lines. It's something that's going to desecrate the temple to such a point that even the Jews are going to say, we can't go there. We've got nothing to do with that place anymore because it is such an abomination to us now. Now, what's the problem with that? Temple's gone. Right? AD 70, it was destroyed. Not one stone stood on top of the other. So how are we supposed to interpret this? Was it something that we missed? Is it something yet to come? There's an organization right now that is Jewish people who it's their main goal in life to rebuild the temple. And steps are moving towards that. The problem is that land is now owned by people who really aren't interested in having the temple built there. So who knows what's going to happen, right? Before 1948, would you have said that this is even a remote possibility? But God is at work, and God can make things happen. I don't know when it's going to happen. I don't know where it's going to happen. I know where, sorry. I don't know exactly what the process will be. But I believe the temple is going to be rebuilt, and then at some point it's going to be defiled. Because Jesus talks about it here. He says, those in Judea must flee to the hills. A person out on the deck of a roof must not go down into the house to pack. A person out in the field must not return even to get a coat. How terrible it will be for pregnant women and nursing mothers in those days. And pray that your flight will not be in winter. For there will be greater anguish in those days than at any time since God created the world. And it will never be so great again. Run for the hills when you see this thing happen. Okay, so you want to know about signs? Disciples, you want to know about signs? Okay, there's going to be war. That's not really a sign. It's going to happen. You're going to have war. You're going to have all this other stuff happen. It's not really the sign you need to look out for. The sign you need to look out for is this thing, when the sacrilegious object comes and desecrates the temple. That's your sign. As soon as that happens, head for the hills. Run. Because those days will be worse than anything ever before or after. In fact, unless the Lord shortens that time of calamity, not a single person will survive. But for the sake of his chosen ones, he has shortened those days. But if anyone tells you, look, here's the Messiah, or there he is, don't believe it. For false messiahs and false prophets will rise up and perform signs and wonders so as to deceive, even God's chosen ones. Wolves in sheep's clothing will come and they will appear to be incredible. They'll appear to be amazing. And there's a part of you that's going to want to chase after. Don't do it. If someone says, look, here's the Messiah, that's not him. Watch out. I have warned you about this ahead of time. Here's another sign. At that time, after the anguish of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will give no light, the stars will fall from the sky, and the powers in the heavens will be shaken. Again, what's that exactly going to look like? I don't know. Is this some kind of metaphor? I can't tell you exactly. I think that this is literal. I mean, I don't literally think that the star is going to fall from the sky because our star is the sun. If it fell from the sky to earth, we would die, right? It would just be the end of the world. But maybe it means there's going to be like shooting stars. I'm not going to give conjecture. I don't know. But here's the thing. Then everyone will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds with great power and glory. And he will send out his angels to gather his chosen ones from all over the world, from the farthest ends of the earth and heaven. And everyone's going to see Jesus coming on a cloud. I mean, we sing Days of Elijah, right? Behold, he comes, riding on a cloud. I'm not going to sing. Everyone's going to see it. Jesus is going to come riding on a cloud with all his angels, and everyone is going to see it. And I would not be surprised if it has something to do with these cell phones. Right? Because, I mean, how am I here going to see what's happening around the other side of the world? Or, if you're in Australia, how are you going to see it? Or wherever you are. But we live in a world where something could be happening. I could literally be watching it live on my phone. Maybe God will do something else. I don't know. And again, there's things here that are kind of confusing, right? Lots of question marks around this passage. I'll be honest, I was not looking forward to preaching this message. All right, as I went through the book of Mark and thought ahead of time, I was like, maybe I can give that one to my dad or something. I don't know. Verse 28, now learn a lesson from the fig tree. When its branches bud and its leaves begin to sprout, you know that summer is near. Jesus has now used the fig tree in a couple different ways. 3, I think, actually, this is the third. And he's just sort of using it as, they're on the Mount of Olives, which apparently was known for its fig trees. And Jesus is just using what's at hand to say, this is the lesson you need to learn, right? You can read the signs. I talked last week about our apple tree. When the leaves start coming, when you start seeing blossoms, you have an idea of how many apples you're going to get. In the same way, when you see these things taking place, you can know that his return is very near, right at the door. I tell you the truth, this generation will not pass from the scene before all these things take place. Heaven and earth will disappear, but my words will never disappear. And then Jesus says something kind of surprising. However, no one knows the day or hour when these things will happen, not even the angels in heaven or the Son himself. Only the Father knows. So he's answered the second question first. What are the signs we should look for? Here's some signs you don't really need to worry about. Here's the sign that run for the hills. And when you see Jesus coming on the cloud, then you know that, and I've come. When will this happen? Even Jesus says, I don't know. Now, Jesus is omniscient, but Jesus chose to put that part of him on hold, basically, for his time on earth, or at least part of his time on earth. And again, question marks. I don't know exactly what that means for Jesus. But at this moment, at this time, Jesus says, I don't know when this is going to happen. Only the Father knows. And then we transition in verse 33. See, up till now, there's been some stuff that I think is kind of interesting, a lot of question marks with it, but now we come to the part where Jesus speaks very, very clearly. You could ask, about metaphors. You could ask about, is he talking historical fact, or is he talking, I don't know, but here he talks very clearly. says, since you don't know when that time will come, be on guard. Stay alert. The coming of man can be illustrated by the story of a man going on a long trip. When he left home, he gave each of his slaves or servants instructions about the work they were to do. And he told the gatekeeper to watch for his return. So we go through the first part of this chapter, and there's so many question marks with it. So many things that you could say, I don't know for sure exactly what that means, but now we come to this part, and it's very, very clear. Be ready. Jesus is the Son of Man. He's going on a long trip, but he's given us a job to do. He's given us a role. He's given us a mission. It says, you too must keep watch, for you don't know when the master of the household will return. In the evening, at midnight, before dawn or daybreak, don't let him find you sleeping when he arrives without warning. I say to you what I say to everyone, watch for him. So you could ask questions about everything else, but the one thing that is totally clear is be ready and watch for Jesus. Be about the business that he has given us. He's given us a mission, so you can ask all kinds of questions, but the thing you need to do is the mission that he gave you. And so there's three ways to respond to a passage like this. The first is to say it's all so vague. We've been waiting so long. This is all irrelevant. We just ignore it. Second way is to say, we need to figure this out, to obsess over it. We need to come up with charts and diagrams, verse cross-references. We need to come up with the exact date when all this will happen. And you see people do this, and I shake my head. I know we're not supposed to call people fools, but someone says, I have determined the day that Jesus will return. It's like, you're a moron. Not even Jesus knew that, okay? I'm sorry, I'm being harsh, but not even Jesus knew it. Why would you want to say, you know for sure when Jesus didn't know? And sure enough, those days come and they go, and the person says, I forgot to carry the one. It's actually going to be 20 years from now. That day comes and goes, and finally they have to admit, I don't know, and then they die and they go to heaven and they have to face Jesus and say, I'm sorry, I thought I was smarter than you. We don't need to figure out what even Jesus said he didn't know. The third way, which I think is the way we're supposed to respond, is we need to hold dear to what Jesus made clear. We need to hold dear to what Jesus made clear. Christ is going to come in victory. So be ready. What would happen in your life if you woke up every morning and said, Jesus is coming soon. I have to live like Jesus is coming soon. Every morning when you woke up, if you sort of had that tattooed on your forehead, Jesus is coming soon, act like it. How would that affect your life? Would it be better or worse? Jesus told us that he is coming back. And no one knows when, but he gave us a job to do. Every church says it differently. In our church, we say love, lead, equip. Love God and love others, and love them enough to lead them to Jesus, and then equip them to do the same. And so you've got this great commandment, great commission. We talked about the great commandment, I think it was last week. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor like yourself. The Great Commission is our verse of the month. Go into all the world and preach the gospel. Tell them. That's the thing that Jesus said. You know what? You can ask all kinds of signs. You can ask questions about the time. I'm giving you a mission. Be ready when I come back. Don't be asleep. Be about the work I gave you. And that's really how we respond to a passage like this. When Jesus comes back, I want him to find me doing what he told me to do. I'm going to ask our prayer team to come up, lead us in a time of prayer.